Would you trust your child's life to someone the world says is nothing? Tonight, a cleaning girl the entire empire treated like furniture is gonna save the one life that makes the most dangerous man in New York fall to his knees. If you've ever felt invisible, stay with me, because the detail that saves everything is always hiding where power refuses to look. Reid Valenti was 36, worth 9 figures, and feared by every criminal organization on the Eastern Seaboard. He could end a man's life with a phone call and erase the evidence before morning coffee. But none of that mattered at 2A, when his 17-month-old daughter Millie wouldn't stop screaming. He'd tried everything: bottle, rocking, colic drops, pacing the halls of his Connecticut estate like a caged animal, while armed guards watched from every corner, not knowing what to do with a boss who looked like he was falling apart. He called his private doctor, a man paid $30,000 a month to be available at any hour. The doctor came and performed a clinical assessment, focusing on internal symptoms. Nothing. He then called in a specialist from Mount Sinai to rule out neurological issues. More tests, more machines, more words that meant nothing, because that baby was still screaming. 7 hours straight. Reid's ex-wife, Paige, picked up from Milan on the 3rd try. "Just handle it, Reid. Kiss her for me." Then she hung up. He stared at that phone and realized something money can't fix. He was completely alone. Meanwhile, 3 floors up, a 27-year-old woman named June Pierce was wringing out a mop at the end of a hallway nobody important ever walked through. Cracked hands, faded uniform, shoes worn thin. She'd worked the night shift here for 2 years, and not a single person in that house knew her name. But June knew something no doctor in that room knew. She knew what that cry meant. She knew it because the last time she heard a sound like that, she didn't move fast enough, and she buried her little brother because of it. Tonight, she moved. She put the mop down, walked down the service stairs, and headed straight toward a nursery full of armed men and Ivy League physicians carrying nothing but a bucket-worn pair of hands and a promise she made to a dead boy named Benny. Did you catch the detail about the blanket wrapped around that baby? Hold on to it. It's gonna matter more than anything in this room. 3 clues are already in front of you. 1 truth, and nobody in that mansion sees it coming except her. If this already got you, smash that like, share it with someone who needs this story tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that nursery door the moment June Pierce knocks. Nothing in Reid Valenti's world will ever be the same. June knocked on the nursery door 3 short times. Not hard, not soft, just enough to cut through the piercing cries spilling out from inside. The thick oak door was heavy, but she knocked on it as if it were the door to the old rented room in Brownsville where she used to live. Without fear, without hesitation, a bodyguard stepped in front of her at once. He was nearly a head taller than she was, broad-shouldered, a gun at his hip, looking down at her the way a man looks at a stray cat that has wandered onto the wrong floor. Restricted area. Go back upstairs. June didn't step back. She spoke calmly, her voice low but every word clear. I need to see Mr. Valenti. It's about his daughter. The bodyguard hadn't even answered yet when the door opened from inside. Reid was standing there. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, his black shirt wrinkled, his right hand still trembling faintly. He looked at June, and in that moment, for the first time in the 2 years she had worked under this roof, Reid Valenti truly saw her, not looked through her, not glanced past her. He looked straight at her, carefully, as if trying to read who she was and why she dared to stand here. Who are you? His voice was rough, exhausted, but it still carried the kind of authority that made most people lower their eyes. June didn't lower hers. I'm the night shift cleaner. 3rd floor. I heard your daughter crying from up there. From behind Reid, Dr. Shaw stepped forward, his face tight with irritation. Mr. Valenti, this woman has no medical training. This room is for medical staff and family only. Dr. Voss, standing beside him, nodded in agreement, still holding her stethoscope, her voice cold. We're handling it. Please step outside. June heard all of it. She didn't argue with the doctors. She didn't launch into a long explanation. She simply looked straight at Reid, ignoring the 2 men in white coats as if they didn't exist, and said, Something is hurting her. Not sickness. Not an infection. Something is touching her body and causing pain every time she moves. Give me 5 minutes. If I'm wrong, I'll walk out of this room and never open my mouth again. The room fell silent. Millie was still crying on the bed, her screams already turning hoarse but not stopping. Dr. Shaw turned to Reid, his voice lowered. Mr. Valenti, I strongly advise against this. We don't know who she is. Dr. Voss added, this is a 17-month-old baby. We can't let someone without medical training. Reid raised his right hand. One single gesture. Both doctors went silent at once. He looked at June. In this room there were 2 top doctors, 3 armed bodyguards, and an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars standing behind him. But the only person looking straight into his eyes without blinking, the only person speaking with absolute certainty, instead of hiding behind medical terminology, was the girl in the faded gray uniform with the worn heels standing in front of him. Reid stepped aside and opened the door wider. Come in. 5 minutes. Dr. Shaw looked ready to say more, but he caught Reid's eyes and swallowed the words. Dr. Voss shook her head and folded her arms, but she didn't dare object again. June stepped across the threshold. She didn't look around the room. She didn't look at the medical monitor, didn't look at the ultrasound equipment, didn't look at the stack of test papers on the table. She looked only at Millie, the tiny baby on the white bed, face flushed red, mouth open, both little fists clenched, wrapped in a white silk blanket trimmed with silver. June looked at that blanket, and her heart began to beat faster. Some people say instinct is only experience that reason hasn't found a name for yet. June had no degree, no certificate, but she had 8 years of pain forged into something no medical school could teach. The ability to hear the difference between a cry of illness and a cry of pain. And this cry, she had heard it before. She knew how it ended if no one acted. She wasn't going to let it end that way again. June walked straight to the sink in the corner of the room. She turned on the water, took the soap, and washed each finger, each space between them, under her nails, so thoroughly that Dr. Voss lifted her head slightly to watch. That wasn't the way a janitor washed her hands. That was the way someone washed her hands before lifting a child she held, as if that child were her own life. June dried her hands with a paper towel, stepped to the bed, and gently lifted Millie into her arms. She supported the baby's head in her palm, pressed her small body against her chest, and whispered a steady stream of sounds without words. Millie was still crying, but the rhythm of her screams softened a little when she felt that warmth close around her. June began to examine her. She didn't use a stethoscope, didn't use a light, didn't use any equipment at all. She used only her 10 fingers. She touched lightly behind Millie's ears, down her neck, beneath both arms, along her spine. Nothing. She took off the tiny sleep suit and checked her chest, her stomach, both sides of her groin, every toe, every finger. No swelling, no redness, no bruises. Dr. Shaw glanced at his watch. It's been 3 minutes. His voice didn't bother hiding the mockery in it. Dr. Voss folded her arms more tightly, her eyes on June with the look of a physician whose patience was running thin. Reid stood against the wall in silence, but his eyes didn't leave June for even a second. He was gambling, and he knew it. June laid Millie gently back on the bed. The baby cried out again, and the moment her back touched the mattress, her whole body went rigid. June stopped. She wasn't looking at Millie anymore. She was looking down at the white silk blanket trimmed in silver spread beneath the baby's back. She lifted the blanket slowly, as if she were holding something precious and dangerous at the same time. She turned it to the front side. She ran her fingers along the silver trim, slowly tracing each decorative stitch. Nothing. She turned it over, touched it again. Then, at the lower right corner, where the trim folded into a sealed crease, her index finger found something. Small, hard, sharp. She used 2 fingers to pull the fold of fabric apart. And there, hidden between 2 rows of silver thread, was a small silver pin. Open. Its sharp point was facing upward. On the tip of the pin was a thin brownish-red mark. Dried blood. The room went silent. Not ordinary silence. The kind of silence that comes when everything people have trusted for 7 hours suddenly collapses in a single second. Dr. Shaw stepped forward, his eyes wide. Dr. Voss let her folded arms fall. Reid didn't move, but all the color drained from his face. June lifted the pin beneath the light between her thumb and forefinger so everyone could see it. Then she said, in a calm voice, as if she were explaining the most obvious thing in the world. It was inside the trim of the blanket. Every time she moved, every time someone wrapped the blanket around her, the point pierced her back. The silk is thick, so you can't see anything from the outside. but she could feel every stab. She looked down at Millie, who was now lying on the bare mattress without the blanket, her cries already reduced to broken little hiccups. She isn't sick. She's in pain. And the source of that pain was hidden inside the very thing everyone thought was protecting her. No one said a word. In that stretch of silence, Millie's hiccups grew softer, and then stopped completely. For the first time in 7 hours, there was no more crying in the room, and that silence was heavier than any scream that had come before it. June lifted Millie from the mattress gently, one hand supporting her back, the other cradling her head, and held the baby against her chest. Millie let out a few more small hiccups, her body still trembling with the leftover force of 7 hours of screaming. June didn't say anything. She only swayed slowly, her breathing even, her chest rising and falling like waves lulling the shore. 1 minute, 2 minutes. The hiccups grew farther apart, the baby's tiny fists unclenched. Her breathing lengthened, deepened. Then Millie fell asleep, her first sleep after 7 hours. Her face was still red, her eyelids still swollen, but her tiny lips had closed in peace. In the arms of the girl who cleaned the floors, the Mafia boss's daughter slept, as if the whole world were safe. Dr. Shaw stepped closer, his voice much lower now, with not a trace of mockery left in it. He gently examined the spot on Millie's back, where the pin had pierced her. A small red scratch, shallow, less than half the length of a fingertip. The wound is very minor, superficial, no infection. It'll heal in a few days without any further treatment. He paused and looked at the pin lying on the stainless steel tray beside the table. But we should have checked this first. Before all the tests. I'm sorry. Dr. Voss stood behind him without speaking, but at some point she had already dropped her folded arms from across her chest. Her eyes stayed on June, holding Millie, and there was something in that look that had changed, something she wasn't ready to name yet. Reid didn't hear the doctor's apology. At some point he had lowered himself into the armchair in the corner of the room, his elbows braced on his knees, both hands covering his face. His shoulders didn't shake. He wasn't crying, but his silence was heavier than any crying could have been. This was the man who controlled an entire underworld empire, the man whose single nod could decide who lived and who died, the man the whole East Coast treated with caution. But right now he was only a father who had just realized that he had put his own daughter in pain with his own hands. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were red, his voice came out rough and slow, each word dragged from his throat by force. That blanket was a gift from Paige, sent from Milan, in a Hermes box. I opened it, saw that it was beautiful, saw that it was soft, saw that it was expensive, and I wrapped my daughter in it without looking closely, without checking, without turning it over to see what was inside. Just because it was expensive, I thought it was safe. Just because it was beautiful, I thought it was good. He looked down at his own hands, hands that had done cruel things, but never before had he hated them the way he hated them now. I used these hands to wrap that thing around my daughter. 7 hours. She was in pain for 7 hours, and I didn't know. June stood beside the bed, Millie still sleeping peacefully in her arms. She looked at Reid and didn't see a boss, didn't see cruelty, didn't see power. She saw only a father tearing himself apart with guilt for something he believed he had caused. She stepped forward and gently laid Millie back in the bed, covering her with the thin hospital blanket Dr. Shaw had brought in his case. Then she turned to Reid. Mr. Valenti, you didn't know. No one knew. The pin was hidden inside a sealed seam. The naked eye couldn't have seen it unless someone touched it with bare hands and found exactly the right spot. You didn't hurt her through carelessness. You did what any father would have done. You gave your daughter what you believed was the best. Don't blame yourself for that. What matters most is that she's all right now. She's sleeping. She isn't in pain anymore. Reid looked at her, for a long time, without speaking. Then he looked over at Millie, breathing steadily on the bed, her tiny fingers loosely curled around the edge of the new blanket. And in his mind, a question began to take shape, a question he hadn't asked about anyone in 20 years of living in the dark. Who was this girl? And why did she understand the one thing no one in his world understood? Reid asked just as June turned her back and started to walk out of the room. How did you know? It wasn't the voice of a boss. It wasn't the voice of a man giving orders. It was the voice of someone who truly wanted to understand. June stopped in the middle of the room, her back still to him. She didn't turn around right away. She stood there for a few seconds, as if she were deciding whether to open a door she had kept locked for 8 years. Then she turned back. Her eyes met Reid's, but she wasn't really looking at him. She was looking somewhere farther away, somewhere deeper, a place only she could reach. Because I've heard that cry before, and that time I didn't act fast enough. She didn't sit down. She remained standing in the middle of the room, her arms resting at her sides, her voice steady, her pace slow. No trembling, no choking up, just a terrifying stillness, the kind that belongs to someone who cried all her tears a long time ago. So now all that's left is the naked truth. My little brother's name was Benny Pierce. When my father died, I was 17, and Benny was 12. My mother had left when I was 6, so there wasn't anyone else, just me. I dropped out of school and worked 3 jobs at once, washing dishes on the morning shift at a restaurant, cleaning hotel rooms in the afternoon, babysitting at night. Benny went to school, came home, cooked noodles for himself, did his homework, then sat and drew until I got back. He loved drawing. He drew everything. He even drew things that didn't exist, cities he imagined, worlds he wished he could live in. He used to say that one day he'd paint murals all over Brownsville, so people would look up at the walls instead of down at the ground. June paused for a beat, not because emotion had caught her, because she was choosing her words, carefully, precisely, as if one wrong word would betray Benny's memory. When Benny was 14, on a Tuesday night, he said he had a headache, a light fever. I thought it was the seasonal flu, but the next morning, I still took him to the community clinic. We waited 3 hours to see a doctor. The doctor looked at him for 5 minutes, said it was an ordinary flu, wrote a prescription for fever medicine, and told me to take him home and let him rest. She drew in a long breath and let it out slowly. 2 days later, the fever got higher. Benny started vomiting. I took him back. A different doctor. He also looked at him for 5 minutes, said it was a seasonal virus, gave him more medicine, told me not to worry so much, said that when an older sister is too protective, children never learn how to get well on their own. I wanted to tell him I wasn't just an older sister. I was the only person Benny had in the world, but I didn't say it. I took the medicine and went home. Reid didn't move. Dr. Shaw stood beside the equipment cabinet, his head slightly lowered. Dr. Voss had stepped back near the door, her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the floor. On Christmas Eve, Benny had a seizure, his whole body locked up, his eyes rolled back, white foam gathered at his mouth. I called 911. The ambulance took 20 minutes to get there. Brownsville on Christmas Eve, the roads jammed, snow falling, and in poor neighborhoods ambulances are never in a hurry. June looked down at her hands, chapped hands, nails cut short, the hands of a cleaning girl. But 8 years earlier, those hands had held a 14-year-old boy convulsing on the kitchen floor of a 5th-floor walk-up apartment. At Brooklyn Public Hospital, they ran tests. Bacterial meningitis. It had already spread. Too late for antibiotics to work. The doctor said that if it had been caught 2 days earlier, just 2 days, Benny would have lived. She stopped. Not to catch her breath, to give the next sentence enough room to stand in the silence. Benny died at 11:47 on Christmas Eve. Snow was falling white outside the emergency room window. I sat beside his bed holding his hand, and his hand kept getting colder. He didn't say anything. He didn't have time to say anything. The last drawing he made is still tucked inside a folder at home, unfinished, a city in the clouds he never got to finish. It felt as if the room had no air left in it. Reid listened, and inside his chest something broke that he couldn't find a name for. After the funeral, Child Protective Services came. They asked me 23 questions. I remember every one of them. Did you neglect him? Did you use drugs? Did you leave him alone overnight? Did you ever hit him? I sat in a cold room, still wearing a shirt stained with Benny's blood, because I hadn't changed since that night, and I had to answer every single question to prove that I deserved the little brother I'd just lost. June lifted her gaze and looked straight at Reid. Her eyes were dry. Not a single tear, and that was what made it terrifying. Tears can empty out, but the dry eyes of someone who has already run out can't be filled by anything. I'd just lost my brother, the only person I had in the world, and instead of being held, instead of being comforted, I had to sit in an interrogation room proving that I wasn't a monster. Because I was poor. Because I lived in Brownsville. Because I didn't have good enough health insurance to take him to a decent hospital from the beginning. My voice wasn't worth a real examination. She breathed in, breathed out, and her voice returned to normal, as if she had just finished talking about the weather. "So when I heard your daughter crying tonight, I couldn't stand upstairs on the 3rd floor mopping and do nothing. I promised Benny that no child would hurt without someone hearing them ever again. Even if I lost my job, even if I had to walk into a room I had no right to enter." Reid stayed silent for a long time. He didn't say "I understand," because he knew he didn't. He didn't say "I'm sorry," because an apology would have been far too small for that kind of pain. He only sat there, in the room where his daughter was finally sleeping in peace, looking at the girl who cleaned his floors and had just told him something she had never told anyone. And for the first time in his life, Reid Valenti met someone whose pain made everything he had ever suffered seem small. The next morning, after June had left the room, and Millie was still sleeping peacefully in her little bed, Reid called Gideon Hale to his study on the 1st floor. Gideon was the only man in the organization Reid trusted without question. 68 years old, his hair pure white, his frame lean, but his eyes still sharp as blades. He had been the Valenti family's consigliere since Reid's father was alive, the man who taught Reid how to read people before Reid ever learned how to hold a gun. Reid placed the silk blanket on the desk, the pin lying beside it inside a small zip bag. "I want to know where this pin came from. Not guesses. I want the truth." Gideon nodded, asked no further questions, and took the blanket away. He had his own people for matters like this. A textile specialist who had once worked for the Federal Bureau of Investigation before moving into what people politely called private consulting, the kind of man who understood fabric the way a forensic doctor understands flesh and bone. The results came back within half a day. Gideon returned to Reid's study in the late afternoon and laid a file of enlarged photographs on the desk. This pin wasn't a manufacturing defect. The blanket's trim was sewn by industrial machine, every stitch perfectly even, with no interruption anywhere that would have allowed the pin to slip in during production. The pin was inserted from the outside after the blanket had already been finished. Someone separated the seam of the trim by hand, slipped the pin inside, then folded it back so the point faced inward. This was deliberate. Reid listened with no expression on his face. But inside him, something had begun to boil. Gideon continued. "The package from Milan, the one from Page, passed through 3 people before it reached Millie's room. First, the international shipper. I checked. Reputable carrier, full camera coverage, seal intact when it arrived at the estate gate. Clean. Second, Rico DeMonte received the package at the security checkpoint for screening. Third, Frank Russo took the package from the security room. The hallway camera shows Frank carrying it straight from Rico's office to your room without stopping anywhere, without opening the box. The timestamp is clear." Gideon stopped there. He didn't need to say more. Rico was the underboss in charge of security screening for everything sent to the estate. Every package, every parcel, every item that could possibly contain danger had to pass through Rico's hands before it was allowed into the house. Rico had signed off on this package as clean in the security log, but the camera showed Rico keeping the package in the security room for 17 minutes before handing it to Frank. 17 minutes. Long enough to open it, place the pin, close it again, and reseal it to look untouched. "It's not direct proof yet," Gideon said. "But Rico is the only link in the chain without a clear alibi." Reid stood and walked to the window. Outside, the estate grounds stretched beneath the Connecticut afternoon light, old oak trees casting shadows across the green lawn. He looked, but he saw nothing. Rico DeMonte, the man who had stood beside him for 20 years. The man he had called brother. The man who knew what whiskey he liked to drink, what haunted him in his nightmares, and how deeply he loved his daughter. If Rico had truly done this, then Reid wouldn't just lose an underboss. He would lose faith in his own ability to read the people closest to him. "Don't do anything yet," Reid said, his voice flat. "Watch Rico, quietly. A traitor will expose himself if he believes he's safe." Gideon nodded, rose, and walked to the door. Before stepping across the threshold, he turned back. "That girl who cleans the floors, she's very good." Reid didn't turn around. "I know." That night, the estate was silent. The guards changed shifts at the gate. The hallway lights dimmed low, and the whole house sank into shadow. Reid sat in the chair beside Millie's bed, the same chair where he had sat for 7 hours the night before in despair. But now Millie was asleep, breathing evenly, her little fingers loosely curled around the edge of the thin quilt. There was no more crying. Reid looked at his daughter and remembered his mother. She had died when he was 17, lung cancer, final stage. In her last days, she had lain in a hospital bed, so thin that her shoulder bones pushed against the cotton of her gown, but her eyes had still been bright. She had held Reid's hand, her own hand cold, but her voice warm. "You'll face a great deal of darkness, Reid. I know that. But promise me one thing. Don't let the darkness swallow all the light in you. Even if you keep only a little, keep it. But keep it." He had broken that promise. Broken it again and again, with every day, every decision, every phone call in which he gave an order he knew his mother would have never forgiven. But tonight, sitting here, watching his daughter sleep peacefully after a nightmare that had lasted 7 hours, he whispered. Not loudly, not clearly, just breath, leaving him with a few words he hadn't spoken to anyone, or to anything, in 20 years. "If someone's listening, I don't know what to call you, but thank you. Thank you for sending her tonight." He didn't know whether he was speaking to God, to his mother, or to the emptiness itself, but for the first time in 2 decades, Reid Valenti felt that his words weren't falling into a void. The next morning, a bodyguard knocked on the servants' room on the 3rd floor, where June was changing into her uniform for the next shift. "Mr. Valenti wants to see you." His study, 1st floor. June had never stepped into Reid's study before. In her 2 years at this estate, she knew very well that there were doors servants weren't allowed to touch, and the heavy oak door at the end of the 1st floor hallway was one of them. She stepped inside. The room was darker than she had imagined. The walls were paneled in dark oak, the velvet curtains half drawn, and natural light slipped through only a narrow opening and fell across the surface of the desk. On the shelf behind the desk, 3 bottles of whiskey stood side by side, the kind she knew each cost as much as a full year of rent for a room in Brownsville. And on the wall opposite the door was a black and white photograph in a silver frame. The man in the picture had eyes like Reid's, but his face was older, harder, and his stare colder. Reid's father, the previous generation boss. Reid sat behind the desk, already changed into a fresh black shirt, his hair combed neatly, looking as if he had never lost 7 hours of sleep the night before. But his eyes still held the red traces that black coffee couldn't erase. "Sit down." June sat in the chair across from him, her back straight, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes looking directly ahead. She didn't look around the room with admiration or curiosity. She looked at Reid and waited. Reid didn't waste time. "I want you to stop working as a cleaner. I want you to take care of Millie full-time. 5 times your current salary, full medical insurance, a private room in the estate on the west wing, close to Millie's room. Starting today." June didn't answer right away. She heard every word clearly, understood every number clearly. 5 times, medical insurance, a private room. These were things she had never had in her life, but she also understood what Reid didn't say out loud. If she accepted, it meant staying in this estate longer. Closer to Reid. Closer to the organization. Closer to the meetings in the basement at midnight. Closer to the unfamiliar faces coming and going with no explanation. Closer to a world where one wrong step could make her disappear, and no one would ask why. "Mr. Valenti, I understand the offer, but you know I know what this house is." Reid didn't deny it, didn't explain, didn't make excuses. He only said, "I know you know, and I'm still offering. Because last night you did what 2 doctors paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year couldn't do. I don't need another person to mop floors. I need someone who knows how to listen to my daughter." June stayed silent. In her mind, 2 images overlapped. Millie in her arms the night before, the baby's fingers loosely holding the edge of her shirt, her face slowly softening, her eyes closing, and Benny at 12, sitting on the kitchen floor of their 5th floor apartment drawing, looking up and smiling when she came home after her dishwashing shift. 2 children. One she had lost. One was here. "I have one condition." Reid leaned back slightly forward. "Say it. If I see anything in this house that threatens Millie, anything at all, whether it comes from an outsider or from you yourself, I'll say it directly. I won't stay silent. I won't look away. And I won't pretend not to see it, even if that means saying it straight to your face. Can you accept that?" Reid looked at her. In 20 years of running the organization, no one had ever set conditions with him. His men took orders, his partners negotiated, his enemies made threats. But no one had ever looked him in the eye and said, "I'll say it to your face and you'll have to take it." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. It wasn't a smile. It was only the sign of something he had forgotten a long time ago. Real respect for someone who wasn't afraid of him. I accept. June nodded. She didn't offer a handshake, didn't say thank you. She only nodded, stood up, and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, she stopped without turning around. I'm starting now. Millie needs breakfast. Then she left. Reid remained alone in the study, looking at the door as it closed, and for the first time in a very long while, he felt that he had just made the right decision without needing a gun, without needing money, and without needing to threaten anyone. June moved her things into the private room in the West Wing that very afternoon. Everything she owned fit inside one old cloth travel bag, 2 sets of everyday clothes, the gray uniform she kept because she didn't know what throwing it away would mean, a few personal hygiene items, and Benny's worn brown leather notebook. The room in the West Wing was 4 times larger than the servants' room on the 3rd floor where she had lived before. A double bed, white blankets, a wooden wardrobe, a window overlooking the lawn behind the estate. Clean, airy, cold. June placed Benny's notebook on the bedside table, then went to Millie's room 3 doors away. From that moment on, her life revolved around a 17-month-old baby and the dangerous breathing rhythm of that house. In the first days, June learned how to read the estate the way she read a face. Morning was the quietest time, guards changing shifts at the gate, Gloria preparing breakfast in the kitchen, Connecticut sunlight slipping through the curtains, and everything looking almost normal. But by afternoon, the rhythm changed. Black cars began pulling up at the side entrance. Men in suits walked in without introductions, without greeting anyone, and went straight down to the basement. The steel basement door closed, and no one said a word about what happened behind it. Night was the worst. June lay in her room, hearing heavy footsteps in the hallway at 1 o'clock in the morning, men's voices speaking quickly in Italian mixed with English, car doors slamming outside at 3 o'clock, and sometimes something drifting up from the basement that she didn't want to name. She didn't ask. She didn't look. She didn't leave the West Wing after 9 at night. Her boundary was clear. Millie, only Millie. She fed Millie, bathed Millie, rocked Millie to sleep, read books aloud to Millie even though the baby didn't understand a single word. She wrote down feeding times, sleep patterns, and body temperature every morning and every evening in her notebook, on fresh pages, right after Benny's unfinished drawings. She kept herself small, discreet, and useful, but in a house like this, even being small was enough to draw attention. Frank Russo was the first to show it. He was 53 years old, the estate's butler since Reid's father's time, a man used to holding authority over every servant in the house, and June's sudden jump from night shift cleaner to the boss's daughter's private caregiver was something Frank couldn't swallow. He didn't speak directly. He never spoke directly. Frank Russo was the kind of man who stabbed with words, not knives. In the first week, he assigned June to clean the first-floor sitting room outside her hours with Millie. You're still an employee of this house. Taking care of a child doesn't mean sitting around. June cleaned without objection. In the second week, Frank spoke in front of 2 guards in the hallway, his voice just loud enough for June to hear as she walked past carrying Millie. Strange times we're living in. A cleaner sits at the same table as the boss now. Maybe those doctors making hundreds of thousands of dollars should go home and learn how to mop floors. The guards laughed softly. June kept walking, didn't turn around, didn't answer. Millie shifted in her arms, and that was the only thing that mattered to her now. But that evening, after Millie had fallen asleep and the estate had sunk into its familiar darkness, June called Nadine on her old phone. Nadine still worked the night cleaning shift at the estate, still the only friend June had in that house. June, I'm telling you the truth. You're playing with fire. Frank hates you. The guards have started whispering, and one of them asked me who you are that the boss favors you. The closer you get to him, the more people will want to bring you down. Do you understand? June understood. She understood more clearly than Nadine imagined. She had grown up in Brownsville, where any child who stood out from the crowd got dragged back down, where climbing higher meant becoming a target. She had lived by that rule her whole life. I know, Nadine. Thank you. So what are you going to do? June looked out the window of her room, the lawn black in the dark, the shadows of the oak trees printed against the moonless sky. I'm staying, because Millie needs me, and I promised someone that I wouldn't walk away again. Nadine sighed on the other end of the line, said nothing more. She knew that once June had decided, no one could change her mind. June ended the call, set the phone down, and looked at Benny's notebook on the bedside table. In this house full of darkness, She only had to hold on to one thing: enough clarity to see danger before it arrived, and enough courage not to run when it finally did. 2 weeks after the night of the pin, Reid and Gideon began pulling on the thread that both men knew could tear everything apart if it was pulled the wrong way. They met every morning at dawn in the study on the first floor, before the estate woke up, before anyone except the night shift guards was in the hallway. Gideon brought black coffee and a small laptop that wasn't connected to the estate's Wi-Fi. Every piece of surveillance data on Rico was stored in that machine and nowhere else. Reid had wanted to act from the very first day. His instinct was to crush a threat before it had the chance to breathe. But Gideon held him back. "We have suspicion, not proof. The camera shows Rico keeping the package for 17 minutes. But 17 minutes could also be explained as a more careful security check than usual. Any lawyer Rico hires will say exactly that. And if you act on suspicion, half the organization will think you're paranoid, and the other half will think you're weak enough to let emotion lead you." Reid hated hearing that, but he knew Gideon was right. Gideon was always right about the things Reid didn't want to hear. In the 3rd week, Gideon found something more important. His men followed Rico outside working hours and discovered that Rico was using a second phone, the kind of prepaid phone bought with cash and registered to no name. Rico used it every Thursday night, always in the same place, the 4th floor parking deck of a shopping center in Stamford, 30 minutes from the estate by car. Gideon couldn't hear the content of the calls, but he traced the number on the other end. It belonged to a contact line linked to the organization that controlled the southern ports, the rival the Valenti family had kept at a distance, through force and quiet agreements for the past 10 years. Rico was talking to the other side. Gideon set the photograph of Rico in the parking deck on the desk, fluorescent light throwing shadows across the underboss's face as he held the phone to his ear. "But I don't know what he's saying. It could be betrayal. It could be Rico playing both sides to make a private profit, while still staying loyal to you. It could be anything. It's not enough to convict him." Reid stood, walked to the window, and stopped in the familiar place where he always stood when he needed to restrain himself. His fists tightened at his sides. "So you're telling me to wait?" "I'm telling you to wait. A traitor will expose himself if he believes he's safe. The moment you act is the moment you tell him you're watching, and then he'll erase evidence, change tactics, or worse, strike first. Patience is the weapon you hate most. But right now it's the only thing keeping the advantage in your hands." Reid didn't answer. He looked out over the lawn, where morning sunlight was falling across the dew, and swallowed the fury burning in his chest. Patience, the hardest thing in the world for a man who was used to solving everything with immediate force. But he held himself back. For Millie, because if he made one wrong move, he wouldn't be the one who paid the price. Meanwhile, 2 floors above, another conversation was taking place. Rico de Monte stood in the basement hallway, his back against the wall, an espresso cup in his hand, his eyes fixed on the staircase where June had walked past carrying Millie 10 minutes earlier. Frank Russo stood beside him, and both men kept looking toward the direction where June had disappeared. "Have you noticed that girl?" Rico asked, his voice low, his eyes never leaving the stairs. Frank shrugged. "A cleaner got promoted. That's the boss's business. I don't interfere." Rico took a slow sip of espresso. "She's not just a cleaner anymore, Frank. She's beside Millie all day. Being beside Millie means being beside the boss's room. Being beside the boss's room means hearing what she shouldn't hear, seeing what she shouldn't see." Frank stayed silent, waiting. Rico set the espresso cup on the window ledge and turned to Frank, his eyes cold. "That girl knows too much." He didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. Frank understood. In this world, that sentence wasn't an observation. It was a verdict. And upstairs on the 2nd floor, June was feeding Millie her morning porridge, completely unaware that her name had just been placed on the scales by men for whom life and death were nothing more than a calculation of advantage. 3 days after the conversation between Rico and Frank in the basement hallway, June found something no one knew had been dropped. That afternoon, Millie fell asleep for her nap earlier than usual. June used the time to tidy the baby's room, wipe the floor, straighten the toy shelf, and check the temperature in the room. She always cleaned thoroughly, not because anyone required it, but because the habit from 2 years of mopping floors had settled into her hands. When she knelt down to wipe beneath Millie's bed, her fingers touched something. Small, paper, folded in half. She pulled it out. A small white slip of paper, no bigger than half her hand, folded in 2, lying in the thin layer of dust near the bed leg, as if it had fallen from someone's shirt pocket or trouser pocket when that person leaned down near the bed, then had been lightly kicked underneath without anyone noticing. June opened it. Inside, written by hand in black ballpoint ink, was a 10-digit phone number. And beneath it, one line written in English shorthand. Phase 2. After the blanket. June read it again. Phase 2. After the blanket. Her heart began to beat faster, but her hands didn't shake. 8 years of surviving in Brownsville since her world fell apart had taught her something no classroom ever could. When you find something dangerous, you don't stand there staring at it. You don't ask anyone, and you don't think too long. You hide it. You remember it. Then you bring it to the right person. She pulled out her old phone and took pictures of the slip, both sides, every line of handwriting clear. Then she folded the paper again and tucked it into the last page of Benny's notebook, where she wrote down everything important. She looked at Millie, still sleeping peacefully on the bed, the baby's face pink and healthy, her breathing light and even, her little fingers loosely wrapped around the ear of a small teddy bear. Then June stood up, walked out of the room, and went straight down to the first floor. She knocked on the door of Reid's study. She didn't wait long. "Come in." Reid was sitting behind the desk, reviewing papers, a glass of whiskey on his right. He looked up at her, and from the look in June's eyes, he knew at once this wasn't about Millie needing a diaper change or running out of milk. June stepped to the desk, placed Benny's notebook down, opened to the last page, took out the slip of paper, and pushed it toward Reid. "I found this under Millie's bed. It was lying close to the bed leg, farther in, like it fell out of someone's pocket." Reid picked up the slip with one hand, opened it, read it. His face didn't change. Not one muscle in that face twitched, but his right hand, the one holding the whiskey glass, tightened, slowly, evenly, until a crack ran down the side of the glass, and whiskey seeped through his fingers onto the oak desk. He didn't look down at the glass. His eyes stayed fixed on the words, Phase 2, after the blanket, after the blanket. The pin in the silk blanket wasn't an accident, that much he already knew, but it also wasn't the end. It had been step 1, and someone had been close enough to his daughter's bed to plan the next step. Reid set the slip of paper down, set the cracked whiskey glass down, and for the first time since June had walked into this room, he looked at her with a different expression. Not the look of an employer toward a servant. Not gratitude. It was the look of a man realizing that the girl standing in front of him was protecting his daughter's life with something no money could buy. Attention in the places no one else bothered to notice. "You just saved my daughter for the second time." June gave a small shake of her head. "I was only cleaning the room. The paper was under the bed in the dust. It was just chance." Reid looked at her, then looked down at the slip, then back at her again. "June, in this house, nothing is chance." He stood up, picked up the cracked glass, set it aside, and walked to the window in the place where he always stood. His back was to her now, his voice lower, no longer speaking to June so much as to himself. "Someone is close enough to enter my daughter's room, close enough to drop this without knowing, and they're planning something bigger than a pin." He turned back. "I'll handle this. But you keep doing what you're doing. Stay near Millie. Keep your eyes open. Keep your ears open. And if you see anything else, no matter how small, you bring it straight here. You don't tell anyone else." "No one." June nodded. She picked up Benny's notebook, closed it again, and walked to the door. By the time the heavy oak door shut behind her, Reid already had the phone in his hand calling Gideon. And upstairs in Millie's room, the baby was still sleeping peacefully, unaware that the real storm hadn't even begun. 1 week after the note under the bed, Renee appeared at the estate gate. She was Tommy's wife, the wife of a lower-level soldier in charge of cargo transport around the port. The kind of man who worked quietly, never raised his voice, and had been loyal to Reid since before Millie was born. Renee was 28, with brown hair tied back in haste, dark circles beneath her eyes, and her 4-year-old daughter balanced on one hip. She asked to see Reid, but the guard at the gate told her he was busy in a meeting downstairs in the basement. Renee stood there, her eyes red, not knowing where to go, until June walked across the yard with Millie in her arms. June looked at Renee and recognized that face at once. Not because she knew Renee, but because she knew that expression. It was the face of a mother who knew something was wrong with her child, and no one believed her. June had worn that face once, 8 years earlier, at a community clinic in Brooklyn, when no one cared to listen to what she was saying about Benny. "Do you need help?" June asked, her voice gentle, not intruding, only opening a door. Renee looked at her, looked at Millie in her arms, and decided to trust her. Over the past month, June had become the name wives and children of the men, whispered to one another when they needed someone to listen. Not a doctor, not a counselor, just someone willing to sit down and ask the right questions. Gloria had told them about June. Nadine had too. The word had spread in the small circle of women living at the edge of the underworld. There was a girl at the estate, once a cleaner, now caring for the boss's daughter, and she knew how to listen, how to ask, and how not to judge. June led Renee into the kitchen, poured water, and pulled out a chair. Millie sat beside them in her stroller, peacefully chewing on a teething ring. Renee's daughter sat in her mother's lap, eyes dull, head drooping against her shoulder, not even bothering to look around. The child was 4 years old, yet she looked as though she had just woken from a sleep that had lasted all day. "What's wrong with her?" June asked. Renee began to tell her, speaking fast, tangled, as if she was afraid that if she stopped, she wouldn't dare continue. "It's been 2 weeks. She's tired all the time. She doesn't play, doesn't run around. She only wants to lie down. I took her to the doctor twice. The first time, the doctor said she wasn't sleeping enough and gave her vitamins. The second time, a different doctor said children go through phases when they become less active, that it was normal. But I know my daughter. She isn't like this. She used to run all day and never get tired. She climbed on everything so much I had to lock the balcony door, and now she just sits in one place staring at the wall." June looked at the little girl. Her eyes weren't feverish, her skin wasn't pale. There were no obvious signs of illness, but that exhaustion, that dullness, didn't belong to a healthy child. June asked calmly, one question at a time. "Has anything changed in what she eats or drinks?" Renee shook her head. "She still eats normally. Rice, noodles, fruit. Has anyone sent her any food or drinks recently? A gift? A gift box? Anything unusual?" Renee started to shake her head, then stopped. Her eyes flickered quickly, as if she had just remembered something she hadn't thought mattered before. Nearly 3 weeks ago, a box of organic fruit juice was delivered to the house. 6 small cartons, nicely packaged. The box said it was a gift from the organization, thanking Tommy for his loyalty. I thought it was normal. The organization sends gifts to the families of the men sometimes. My daughter loved it, drank 1 carton every day. June felt a chill rise at the back of her neck. She didn't say anything to Renee then. She only told her to wait, then carried Millie straight to find Dr. Shaw. He was in the medical room on the 1st floor, where he came once a week to examine Millie. June spoke quickly and directly. "I need you to run blood work on a 4-year-old girl. She's had unusual fatigue for 2 weeks. Outside doctors said she was fine, but she's been drinking fruit juice from an unverified source. I think there's something in it." Dr. Shaw looked at June. A month ago, he would have refused, but a month ago, he also wouldn't have believed that the girl who cleaned the floors would find the pin that he and Dr. Voss had both missed. He nodded, gathered his supplies, and followed June down to the kitchen. He drew the girl's blood, sent it off for priority testing. The results came back in 4 hours. There was a low-dose sedative in the child's blood, the kind used in adult sleeping medication, mixed in a very small amount, enough to cause prolonged fatigue, lack of energy, and dullness, but not enough to create immediate danger, or the kind of symptoms an ordinary doctor would catch during a general examination. Someone had mixed it into the fruit juice with frightening precision, enough to harm, not enough to leave obvious traces. Dr. Shaw brought the results to Reid. June went with him. Reid read them, his face still unreadable, but he stood up slowly, walked to the window, and stood in silence for a long time. Gideon traced the fruit juice box within 2 days. The box had been ordered from an organic shop in Stamford, paid for in cash, shipped through a delivery service, and the buyer had used a false name. But the shop's camera captured the man who placed the order, a driver Gideon recognized as Rico's backup driver, the one who usually handled errands for the underboss. The pattern was clear now, the pin in Millie's blanket, the Phase 2 note in Millie's room, the fruit juice laced with sedatives sent to a subordinate's home. Rico wasn't only targeting Reid's daughter, he was creating instability from within. shaking the families of the men beneath Reid, planting suspicion, planting fear, so that when the time came for him to make his move and seize power, Reid's foundation would already be rotting from the inside out. Reid stood at the window with his back to June and Gideon. His voice was low, even, and colder than anything she had ever heard from him before. Enough. Call a closed meeting. The meeting took place at 10 o'clock that night, in the basement conference room, the room June had never stepped into and had never imagined she would. Concrete walls, yellow light, a long wooden table, no windows. Reid sat at the head of the table. Gideon sat on his right. 4 senior men sat along both sides, their faces tight, silent. Rico DeMonte sat across from Reid at the far end of the table, an espresso cup in front of him, his posture relaxed, one leg crossed over the other, as if this were an ordinary dinner. June stood in the corner of the room beside the door. She didn't sit. Reid didn't invite her to sit, and she didn't ask. She knew she was here not because she had any right to be. She was here because she was a witness. Reid began without wasting words. He placed 4 things on the table in order: the small silver pin inside a zip bag, the enlarged photograph of the blanket trim showing that the pin had been inserted from the outside, the note that read, Phase 2, after the blanket, and the blood test result from Renee's daughter clearly listing the sedative compound. A month ago, my daughter cried for 7 hours because of this pin. A specialist confirmed that the pin was inserted into the blanket after production, deliberately. The package passed through 3 people before it reached Millie's room. The shipper is clean. Frank has camera footage proving his part. That leaves 1 person. He didn't look at Rico yet. He continued, This note was found under my daughter's bed. Phase 2, after the blanket, which means the pin was only the first step. He pushed the test result toward the middle of the table. Tommy's daughter was given fruit juice laced with a low-dose sedative for 2 weeks. The juice was sent in the organization's name through an intermediary. Store camera footage shows that the man who placed the order was the backup driver of someone in this room. Then he looked at Rico. And the prepaid secondary phone of someone in this room has been in contact with the organization controlling the southern ports every Thursday night in the 4th floor parking garage in Stamford. The room fell silent. The 4 senior men looked from Reid to Rico, then down at the table. No one wanted to be on the wrong side in the next 10 seconds. Rico set down his espresso cup. Slowly, he didn't look at the evidence on the table. He looked straight at Reid. You're accusing me. I'm laying out the truth. Whether it becomes an accusation depends on your answer. Rico leaned forward, his hands clasped together, then turned his head toward the corner where June was standing. The truth. Whose truth? He pointed at June. Hers? That floor-cleaning girl you picked up because she knows how to soothe a child? You trust her word more than mine, after I've stood beside you for 20 years? Rico rose to his feet, his chair scraping back, his voice lifting higher. Don't you see it? She wants to climb. She's making stories, creating credit for herself, turning herself from a floor rag into someone indispensable, and you're falling for it. He turned toward June and took 2 steps toward her. Do you know what your place is? You're nobody. You came here to mop floors, and you should go back to mopping floors before you step into a place you don't belong. June didn't step back, didn't lower her eyes, didn't swallow. She looked straight into Rico's eyes, and in the yellow light of that windowless basement room, her voice rang out clearly, each word sharp, not loud, not soft, only steady enough for everyone at the table to hear. You're right. I'm a floor-cleaning girl. I'm nobody, but I'm also the one who bends low enough to see the things you men stand too high to ever notice. The room went still. 2 of the senior men glanced at each other. One of them gave the slightest involuntary nod. Rico opened his mouth to keep talking, but Gideon spoke from Reid's right side. His old voice was slow and even, the kind of voice everyone in the room knew should be listened to when it spoke. Rico, I've known you for 20 years. I've respected you, but evidence doesn't lie. The pin wasn't a factory defect. The note didn't write itself. The sedative didn't jump into the fruit juice on its own. And your backup driver didn't go buy drinks for the wives and children of our men without orders. Gideon placed both hands on the table and looked straight at Rico. Explain it, Rico. Explain it to all of us. Rico stood in the middle of the room, between June and the table, between 20 years of false loyalty and 4 concrete walls with no way out. His eyes moved from Gideon to Reid, to the 4 silent men, then back to June. And in that moment, In his eyes, June saw something she had seen many times in Brownsville. An animal cornered, with nowhere left to retreat, getting ready to bite. Everything happened in less than 10 seconds. Rico reached his right hand behind his back, pulled the gun from the waistband of his trousers, and aimed it straight at Reid. The movement was fast and clean, the movement of a man who had practiced all his life. The 4 senior men at the table shoved their chairs back at once. Gideon didn't move. Reid didn't move. June, standing in the corner of the room only 2 steps from Rico, felt the air thicken like concrete. 20 years, Rico said, his voice shaking, not from fear but from something deeper than fear, something that had been rotting inside him for 2 decades and was only now splitting open. 20 years I stood beside you. 20 years I killed for you, negotiated for you, carried the risk for you, and what did you get? Everything. Because you're your father's son, because you inherited it. And me, I built every brick of this empire with blood, and what did I get? Underboss. A meaningless title so you could send me around like a servant. The barrel of the gun pointed straight at Reid's chest. Reid didn't step back. His eyes stayed on Rico, and there was no anger in them, only the quiet disappointment of a man who had just confirmed what he had suspected, but never wanted to believe. Put the gun down, Rico. No. Rico stepped back once, and that single step brought him exactly to where June was standing. His left hand shot out, grabbed June by the collar, and yanked her against him. June lost her balance and fell into Rico's body, and before she could react, the barrel had left Reid's chest and was pressed against her temple. Cold steel, hard, against her skin. June could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, fast and wild, but her body didn't fight back. Instinct from Brownsville. When you're cornered, don't startle, don't struggle. Stay still. Breathe. Wait. This girl knows too much, Rico said, his breath hot against the back of June's neck, his hand tightening around her collar. She found the pin. She found the note. She found the fruit juice. How does a girl who mops floors know where to look unless someone tells her? Or did you place her here from the beginning? Reid, you've suspected me for a long time, haven't you? Reid took 1 step forward. Only one. His face didn't change. Not one muscle moved. Not one eye narrowed. But his right hand, hanging at his side, was trembling. Slightly. Almost too little to see. But June saw it. From the corner of her eye, she saw the hand of the Mafia boss shaking because of her. Let her go. 3 words. His voice was flat, but each word carried the weight of 20 years of absolute power. Rico laughed, a dry, broken sound. The most ruthless boss on the East Coast, the man the whole city fears, going soft over a girl who used to mop floors, over a girl with a rag and a bucket. Reid took another step. The distance between him and the gun pressed to June's head was now less than 2 meters. I'm saying it one more time. His voice dropped lower, so low it no longer sounded like speech but like a growl held down inside his chest. Let her go. Gideon, who had sat motionless from the beginning, quietly lifted his right hand to the table and tapped 2 fingers against the wood. 2 soft taps, a signal. The steel door behind them opened. 4 bodyguards stepped in, guns already drawn, 4 barrels aimed at Rico from 4 directions. Rico looked around, looked at the guards, looked at Reid, looked at Gideon, looked at the 4 senior men at the table, not one of them moving to help him. 20 years, and this was all he had earned. 4 guns pointed at him, and not a single ally. Rico's hand released June's collar. The gun lowered. The guards rushed forward, slammed him to the floor, and locked his hands behind his back. Rico didn't resist. He only lay there, his cheek pressed to the cold concrete, his eyes still fixed on Reid, and in those eyes there was no hatred left, only the emptiness of a man who had burned through everything and had nothing left to set on fire. June stood alone in the corner of the room. Her legs were shaking. Her knees wanted to give out, but she didn't fall. She stepped back until her spine hit the wall, then slowly slid down until she was sitting on the concrete floor. Both arms wrapped around Benny's notebook against her chest, holding it tight, as if that notebook were the only thing keeping her from coming apart. Reid watched Rico being dragged away, watched the steel door close. Then he turned toward the corner where June was sitting on the floor. He walked over there, and he sat down, right on the cold concrete beside her. The most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast, the man everyone in the room had just looked at with fear and reverence, sitting on the basement floor beside the girl who used to mop floors, as if it were the only place he belonged right then. "Are you all right?" June looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but no tears fell. Her arms were still wrapped around Benny's notebook. "I'm all right." She drew in a shaky breath, then asked, "Is Millie all right?" Reid looked at her. She had just had a gun pressed to her head. She had just almost died in the basement room of an underworld empire where she didn't belong. And the first thing she asked was about his daughter. The corner of Reid's mouth lifted. Not a smile, only the shadow of one, thin as smoke, but it was the closest thing to a real smile he had worn in many years. "Millie's all right." They sat there on the cold concrete floor, in the basement room that had just witnessed the collapse of 20 years of betrayal, and neither of them said another word. But in that silence, something had begun that neither of them was ready to name. Gideon asked Reid the next morning, while Rico was still being held in the locked room in the basement, "How do you want this handled?" In their world, that question had only one meaning, and the usual answer never had anything to do with a courtroom. Reid stood by the window in his study, looking out at the lawn where Millie was sitting in her stroller beneath the shadow of the oak tree, June beside her, reading something aloud to the baby. He watched the two of them for a long time before he answered, "Turn him over to the FBI, through our channel. Let the law deal with him." Gideon was silent for 3 seconds. It was the longest silence the old man had ever given to any answer Reid had spoken. Then he nodded. "All right." He didn't ask why. He didn't object. Gideon had lived long enough to recognize when a man had begun to change, and he was wise enough not to stand in the way. Rico was moved out that night, quietly, without noise, through a line of communication the Valenti organization had maintained with the Federal Bureau of Investigation for years, the kind of line both sides pretended didn't exist but both sides needed. The evidence was enough to make sure Rico wouldn't see free sunlight again for a very long time. The rival organization that controlled the southern ports lost its only informant inside the Valenti empire, and without Rico to guide them, they pulled back, not because they feared Reid, but because they no longer had a way in. 2 weeks after the closed meeting, Reid called June into his study for the second time. This time he wasn't sitting behind the desk. He was standing beside the bookshelf, a thin file in his hand. "I want to establish a foundation, a medical support foundation for children from low-income families. Free examinations, free treatment, no child turned away for lack of insurance. I'll fund all of it." He placed the file on the desk. "The name of the foundation is Benny Foundation." June stood still, looked at the file, looked at the name on the cover. Benny, her brother's name, the name of the boy who drew cities in the clouds and never got to finish them. The name of the child who died on Christmas Eve because no one was willing to listen when his sister said he was truly sick. "I want you to run this foundation," Reid said. "Not because you have a degree in management, but because you know exactly what it feels like to stand at the doors of a hospital and be sent away. You won't let that happen to anyone else." June didn't answer at once. She picked up the file, opened the first page, and read through the terms of establishment. Then she closed it again and looked at Reid. "I'll do it, but you need to understand one thing. This isn't your foundation. It's Benny's foundation. Your name won't appear anywhere." Reid almost smiled. "Agreed." Over the next month, Benny Foundation took shape. June ran it from a small room on the first floor of the estate, a room that had once been the night shift guard station. Nadine, after hearing everything, quit her job as a cleaner and moved over to help June full-time, handling contact with the families who needed support. Gloria, the estate's cook, volunteered to prepare food for the free clinic events the foundation held each month. Dr. Shaw, after everything that had happened, called June one morning and said simply, "I'll examine patients for the foundation free of charge once a month. Consider it my way of repaying the debt I owe for the night I missed the pin." But the most unexpected change came from Frank Russo. The butler didn't apologize to June. He didn't say a word about the months he had made things difficult for her, spoken in veiled insults, or assigned her heavy work. He only did one small thing. On the first morning, June opened the door to her new office. A hot cup of coffee was already on the desk, along with a small note written in Frank's handwriting. "The room has been cleaned. If you need more bookshelves, tell me." June looked at the coffee, looked at the note, and understood. In this world, that was the largest apology Frank Russo was capable of giving. She drank the coffee, opened Benny's notebook to a fresh page, and began writing down the first list of families they needed to contact. Outside the window, Connecticut sunlight spread across the estate lawn, and somewhere upstairs on the second floor, Millie was babbling her first sound, which Gloria swore sounded like Jew. What grew between them didn't begin with words. There was no declaration, no sudden moment. It came through 5 times, 5 small details, each one as light as breath but heavier than any promise. The first time was on a March evening. June was rocking Millie to sleep in the baby's room, humming something softly, no words, only a steady melody, her hand patting Millie's back in rhythm. She didn't know Reid was standing in the doorway. He stood there, his shoulder against the wooden frame, his arms folded across his chest, watching her sing his daughter to sleep. The pale yellow glow of the night lamp fell across June's face, and he saw something he had never seen in that house before. Peace. He stood there for 10 minutes. Millie had fallen deeply asleep by the 3rd minute, but he didn't step inside. When June began to rise, he turned away, walking quietly down the hallway of the west wing and back to his room. June turned toward the door and saw the hallway empty. Only the faint scent of whiskey still lingered in the air. The second time came 3 weeks later. June caught a cold, a light fever, her body exhausted, but she still got up at 6 to prepare breakfast for Millie. Gloria forced her back into bed and said Gloria would take care of it. June lay in her room, eyes closed, one hand resting on Benny's notebook out of habit. A knock at the door. She opened her eyes. Reid was standing outside, holding a bowl of hot chicken porridge on a wooden tray. He set the tray on the table beside her bed without looking at her, as if looking at her just then would break something he was trying to keep intact. Gloria made it. I only brought it up. Don't tell anyone. Then he walked out and closed the door. June looked at the steaming bowl of porridge, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt that someone was taking care of her. Not out of duty, not because of a contract, just because he wanted to. The 3rd time was on a May night, at 3 in the morning. June woke to the sound of something coming from Reid's room at the end of the hallway. Not talking. A shout, short, sharp, then silence, then another shout. A nightmare. She lay still for a minute, then got up, walked to his room, and knocked softly. The door opened. Reid stood there, hair disheveled, sleep shirt soaked with sweat, eyes wild like a man who had just run from something he still couldn't escape even after waking. She didn't ask what he had dreamed. She didn't ask if he was all right. She only said, I'll make tea for you. Chamomile. My brother used to like it when he couldn't sleep peacefully. She went down to the kitchen, boiled water, made 2 cups, carried them back up. They sat at the small table beside the window in Reid's room, each holding a cup, saying nothing. Outside, the Connecticut sky was pitch black, no moon, no stars. They sat there until the tea went cold. Then June stood up, gathered the 2 cups, and went back to her room. No good night. None was needed. The 4th time was the heaviest. One afternoon, June was carrying Millie past the basement hallway, just as the steel door opened. She caught a glimpse inside. Men seated around a table, stacks of money, papers spread everywhere. She didn't stop, didn't look long, but that night, after Millie had fallen asleep, she went to Reid's study. Do you want Millie to grow up seeing who her father is? Do you want her to be proud? Or do you want her to be afraid? Because if you keep making money the way you're making it now, there'll come a day when she's old enough to understand. And on that day, you won't be her hero anymore. Reid didn't answer. His face hardened, his jaw tightened. He stood up and walked out of the room without a word. He disappeared from the estate for 3 days. No one knew where he had gone. No calls, no messages. June took care of Millie, ran the foundation, and every night she looked out the window wondering whether she had gone too far. On the 4th day, she was feeding Millie porridge in the kitchen that morning when Reid walked in. His beard wasn't shaved, dark circles under his eyes, but something in his gaze had changed. He sat down in the chair across from her, looked at Millie, then looked at June. I hated you because you were right. I drove for 3 days trying to think of a reason you were wrong. I couldn't find one. So I came back, because I need you to keep being right, even when I hate hearing it. June didn't smile, but she pushed Millie's bowl of porridge a little closer to him. Feed her. She misses you. Reid took the spoon, and for the first time, he fed his daughter with his own hand. Awkwardly, porridge ended up all over Millie's chin, but the baby laughed, and that laughter filled the kitchen more completely than any words could have. The 5th time came 4 months later, outside family court in Manhattan. Paige filed for custody of Millie, not because she wanted the child, but because her lawyer had calculated that custody would open a path to Reid's assets. June helped Reid prepare the file, Millie's daily medical records that June had kept for months, her feeding and sleeping schedule, regular health reports from Dr. Shaw, photographs of Millie every week, every stage of her growth carefully recorded in Benny's notebook. The court reviewed the file, reviewed the evidence that Paige had been entirely absent from her daughter's life since the divorce, and granted Reid full custody. Outside the courthouse, it was September in New York. Pale sunlight, cool wind. Reid stepped down the courthouse stairs, June walking beside him. Neither of them said anything. Then Reid reached out and took June's hand. Gently, without tightening his grip, he simply held it. The first time he had ever touched her. Not a handshake, not by accident, but on purpose, slowly, as if he had wanted to do this for a very long time but had needed to wait until there was a reason big enough that he could no longer lie to himself. June felt his hand, warm, broad, a hand that had done many cruel things but was now holding hers with a care she had never known he possessed. She let it stay for 3 seconds. Then she pulled her hand back, gently, not abruptly, not because she didn't want it, but because she was afraid that if she let her hand stay there 1 second longer, she would want more than that. And wanting more than that, in Reid Valenti's world, was the most dangerous thing a girl from Brownsville could ever allow herself. Millie turned 2 on a Sunday in October, under pale golden Connecticut sunlight, with the oak leaves outside beginning to turn red. The small party was held in the estate dining room, with no elaborate flowers, no event company hired, only a white cake Gloria had made herself starting at 4 in the morning, a few balloons Nadine had blown up until her face turned purple, and a teddy bear, nearly half Millie's size, that Dr. Shaw brought in a box wrapped with an awkward ribbon. The guest list could be counted on 2 hands. Gideon sat in the corner of the room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes softer than usual as he watched Millie scoop frosting with both hands and smear it all over her face. Nadine and Gloria stood side by side, Gloria laughing as she wiped Millie's face clean. Dr. Shaw stood with his arms folded, awkward in the middle of a children's party he clearly wasn't used to. A few trusted men stood nearby, men who normally carried guns on their bodies, but who today were clapping and singing Happy Birthday badly out of tune. Reid stood farther back, leaning against the wall, silently watching his daughter. Millie sat in her high chair, frosting on her face, bright eyes shining, her hair in soft little curls, and when she turned her head to look for someone in the room, she didn't call for Daddy. She called, "Juju, Juju." June was standing near the kitchen door, a paper towel in her hand. When she heard that, she froze for a beat. Juju, the nickname Millie had made up because she couldn't pronounce June. 2 short syllables, ringing through a room full of dangerous men and frosting smeared across the table, and it was the most beautiful sound June had heard since the last time Benny called her sister. She walked over, lifted Millie into her arms, and the little girl wrapped her arms around June's neck, smearing frosting onto the shoulder of June's blouse. June didn't care. She held the child more tightly, closed her eyes for 1 second, and when she opened them again, she caught Reid looking at her from across the room. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He only looked. But his eyes said more than anything he had ever spoken aloud. The party ended at 8 that evening. Millie was fast asleep in her bed, her belly full, one hand still clutching her new teddy bear. The guests had all gone home. The estate had settled into quiet. June went upstairs to the 3rd-floor balcony on the east side. She knew that place better than anyone. 2 years earlier, she had mopped that balcony floor every night, knees pressed against cold stone, hands wringing a rag over a bucket of water, looking out over the black lawn and thinking of nothing except finishing before 5 in the morning. Now she stood there with her hands resting on the railing, October wind brushing lightly past her, and her life had changed so completely that she couldn't say exactly when it had begun to change. Footsteps sounded behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew who it was. Reid stepped beside her, an arm's length away, looking out in the same direction. Silence stretched between them for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low and slow, each word pulled from his throat with difficulty, as if every word weighed more than it should have. "I don't know how to say this. I know how to give orders. I know how to threaten. I know how to negotiate. But this is different, and I don't have words for it." June looked at him. "What's different?" Reid kept his eyes on the dark lawn. "You." One word, then silence. Then he went on, still not looking at her, as if looking at her now would keep him from finishing. I don't deserve it. I know what I am. I know what these hands have done. I know what my world is. But you. He stopped, drew in a breath, then continued. You make me want to become a better man. Not because you ask me to, but because when you're near, I can see the version of myself my mother once hoped I would become. And that. He turned to look at her for the first time since stepping onto the balcony. That scares me more than any enemy I've ever faced. The balcony fell quiet. The wind moved softly. Somewhere in the darkness, oak leaves drifted down. June looked at him, looked into those eyes that had ordered men killed, eyes that had looked at enemies without blinking, but were now looking at her with a fear he didn't know how to hide. She could have cried. She could have said something deep, something solemn, something worthy of a moment like this. But June wasn't that kind of person. June was a girl from Brownsville, the one who had once scrubbed this balcony floor on her knees, the one who had buried her brother and gone back to work the next day. She looked at Reid and said, "Then you owe me interest on that." Reid blinked. Then he laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a mocking laugh. A real laugh breaking out from his chest, dry, short, unexpected even to himself, like rain falling on a desert, so rare that both of them knew exactly how precious it was. And there on the third-floor balcony, where 2 years earlier she had knelt to scrub the floor while he hadn't even known she existed, the two of them stood side by side, an arm's length apart, and for the first time, that distance didn't feel like distance at all. 5 years after that night on the third-floor balcony, Millie was 7 years old. Brown curls, big eyes like her father's, but her smile was June's, the kind of smile that used her whole face and held nothing back. That afternoon, Millie was sitting on the floor of the estate living room, crayons scattered all over the rug, bent over, a 4-sheet of paper, drawing with complete concentration. When she finished, she ran to June, who was sitting on the sofa reading foundation files, and held the paper up in front of her face. "Juju, look." The picture showed 3 people. The tallest one on the left had black hair and wore black clothes, with the messy word Daddy written underneath. The smallest one in the middle had curls and a pink dress, with Millie written below, and the one on the right had brown hair and wore gray, with Juju written underneath. The 3 of them were holding hands. Above them was a yellow sun as big as half the page. Below them, in tiny crooked letters, were the words, "My family." June looked at the picture, and tears fell down her face, not because she was sad, but because of Benny. Benny used to draw like that too. Crayons on the kitchen floor of their 5th-floor apartment in Brownsville, knees pulled up, tongue sticking out when he focused. Cities in the clouds that the 14-year-old boy never got to finish. Millie didn't draw better than Benny had, but Millie was alive, and that was the miracle June had never dared to ask for, yet had still been given. She pulled Millie into her arms, held her tightly, and cried into the little girl's hair while Millie patted her back with a tiny hand still covered in waxy color. "Juju, are you crying? Why are you crying? Did I draw bad?" "No, you drew the most beautiful picture in the world." Reid was 42. His hair had gone gray at both temples, his face still sharp, but the lines of it had softened, like stone worn down by water over time. He had stepped away from most of the underworld operations, leaving what remained to Gideon to manage, and had focused on legal real estate and Benny Foundation. Not because he had suddenly become a saint, but because every evening when he came home and saw Millie run to wrap herself around his legs, he didn't want his daughter to grow up and one day feel ashamed when she heard people speak her father's name. June was 33. She still wore simple clothes. Her hands still cracked in the cold even though she no longer held a mop, and she still kept Benny's notebook on her bedside table. But now the notebook was 3 times as thick, stuffed with papers, records, and names. Every new page held another child the Foundation had helped. The little boy in the Bronx whose asthma was caught in time. The little girl in Newark whose heart condition was correctly diagnosed before it was too late. The child in Camden whose mother had been turned away by doctors 3 times, until June sat down and listened to that mother, asked the right questions, and sent her to the right doctor. That night, Millie was asleep. Her room was quiet, the nightlight pale gold, the teddy bear from her 2nd birthday still beside her pillow even though the stuffing had gone soft and thin. June sat beside the bed, smoothing Millie's hair. Reid walked in quietly and stood on the other side of the bed. They looked at Millie sleeping, and without saying a word, They both knew that on that first night, nearly 6 years ago, in this very room, the baby's desperate crying had pulled them toward each other, and now the peace in her sleep was what kept them there. Reid reached his hand across the bed and took June's hand, gently, like he had outside the courthouse. But this time June didn't pull away. She let her fingers thread through his, and she kept them there. "Benny would have been proud of you." June looked at him, her eyes wet, but her mouth smiling. "Benny led me here. To Millie. To you. Every child we save is a kiss I send to him." She gently slipped her hand away, opened Benny's notebook, and took out the small photograph tucked into the first page. It was Benny at 13, grinning wide, crayons in his hand, eyes bright. She placed the picture on Millie's bedside table, beside the photograph of newborn Millie that Reid had kept there since the day she was born. 2 children, one gone, one living. One a pain that had turned into strength, one a strength that had grown into love. Side by side, on the same table, in the same house where, 6 years earlier, a girl who cleaned floors had knocked on the nursery door and changed everything. And that's how this story ends. Not with a miracle or money, but with hands once cracked from buckets of water now holding the hand of the man the world fears, beside the bed of the child they both love. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to hear more stories every day. We thank you for staying with us, wishing you and your family peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.